This is the story of how my grandmother fell in love and married the American soldier who liberated her. My grandmother, Gerda Weissman, was born in Bielsko, Poland in 1924. She was 15 years old when the Nazis occupied her town. After being separated from her brother and later her parents, she survived 3 years in slave labor and concentration camps. My grandfather, Kurt Klein, was born in Waldorf, Germany in 1920. In 1937, he escaped Nazi Germany for the United States. His siblings were able to come as well, but unfortunately, despite their best efforts, his parents did not make it and were murdered in Auschwitz. My grandfather was drafted into the US Army. He was recruited as a Ritchie Boy to be trained in counterintelligence. He returned to Europe with the US Army later in the war. Then, in January 1945, she began what would become a 3-month, 350-mile death march through Germany and Czechoslovakia. On May 6, 1945, my grandmother, along with the 120 remaining girls of the more than 2,000 who began the death march, arrived in Volary, Czechoslovakia. The SS guards wanted to run, and before they did, they locked the 120 girls in an abandoned factory and set a time bomb on it. That night, there was torrential rain, and with the ensuing mud, the bomb did not connect and go off. The next morning, she was free. She stood at the door of the factory and saw a car coming down the road. But instead of the swastika on the hood of the car, what she saw was the white star of the US Army. A man jumped out and came over to her. He asked her if she spoke English or German, and she answered in German. She said to him, "We are Jewish, you know." And he replied, after what seemed to her like a long time, and said, "So am I." To be liberated by both an American and by a Jew was the ultimate entry into freedom. That night in the hospital, my grandmother prayed for the safety of the young American soldier whose name she did not yet know. He returned to the field hospital a few days later and introduced himself to her as Lieutenant Kurt Klein. When she was liberated, she weighed 68 pounds, her hair was white, and it was the day before her 21st birthday. While she recovered in the hospital, Kurt would come and visit her. He became known throughout the field hospital as Gerda's lieutenant. Before his unit left Volary, he gifted her a photo of himself, and she asked him to write a message on the back of it, in English, which my grandmother did not yet know, to Gerda at the start of a new life, Kurt. In September 1945, my grandfather received orders to return to the United States. Before he left, he proposed to my grandmother. They also began writing letters to one another. "I love you, and by some miracle, you love me too. I went into the war to fight, expecting only ugliness and pain, but I found love." He told her he was going back to the United States, and she just said, "Okay, thank you for everything," because she didn't realize that he was in love with her. And he said, "Is that all you have to say to me?" And then he said, "I want you to come to America." Unfortunately, at the time, it was not possible for her to go with him. In September 1945, my grandmother wrote him a letter. In it, she wrote, "Yes, for the 3rd time in my life, I am experiencing the excruciating pain that all that is dearest to me and to which I clung the most has been taken from me. First Arthur, then my parents, and now you. Forgive me for not being as brave as I should have been when I said goodbye to you, but I promise you I shall be from now on. You see, from the moment that I was permitted to think of you differently, to think of you as mine, the thought processes about my parents changed. My pain is losing its burning rage. The sharp edge of bitterness is softened by your love." In those 9 months, they wrote letters back and forth to each other. They talked about their families, their pasts, their dreams for the future, and the challenges for my grandmother of living in Germany after the war, and for my grandfather of returning to civilian life. Eventually, 9 months later, they were reunited and married in Paris on June 18, 1946. They had with them photos of each of their parents in order to honor them since they had not survived. They took a photo on their wedding day, and just like he had done while my grandmother was in the hospital, on the back of the photo he took, he wrote, the next 75 years will be easier. After they were married, they returned to Buffalo, New York. There, my grandfather worked in a printing press while my grandmother began to learn English and acclimate to the United States. They would have 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and so far, they have 19 great-grandchildren. They were married for over 55 years. They dedicated their lives to sharing their stories in the hopes that never again would others experience what they had.